Okay, so we're going to do a little lecture today, as you guys know, on The Handmaid's Tale. What I'm going to look through is religion in the 1980s. I'm going to look at the dystopian tradition, AO4. I'm going to look at dictatorship in Gilead, and in particular look at, say, the Nazis. Then I'm going to look at elements of postmodernism and the idea of a fragmented narration, and also briefly touch upon metafiction, which we've already covered in Atonement. I will look also at The Handmaid's Tale and different types of feminism. In fact, I'd like to remind you that when we talk about feminist critics, there's no such thing. There are very, very different and often contradictory forms of feminism. And I'm going to talk about the paradox of feminism, and by that what I mean is that in some ways Atwood sees certain feminist narratives I think is quite dangerous. And then I'm finally going to talk about the attack on the academy, okay? And the idea of history, objectivity, and perhaps see that from a feminist perspective as a phallocentric idea of what history is, okay? Firstly, I'm going to talk about these two people over here, okay? Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Now, Reagan came to power in the early 80s in the United States. Many of you will know that this was a sharp turn to the right in American politics, towards conservatism. And I think what scared liberals at the time is that Reagan really did declare war on them. Some of you who know about politics will know one of the people who helped get Reagan elected was a guy called Roger Stone. And Roger Stone's idea was get elected by whatever means, and then use hatred. And this is one thing that I think began to characterize the right, was a sense of absolute hatred. Hatred of liberals, a hatred of people who practice abortion, a hatred of people who they saw as ungodly, a hatred of people who wanted to take their guns away. So a very, very militant age. I think similarly in the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher came to power and she declared war on trade unions, on liberal traditions which she saw as permissive. She argued that they were lazy, that there was no work ethic, and that people were immoral. So on both sides of the Atlantic, a real turn to the right. What was different in Britain, of course, is that religion played less a role. That's because Britain is a far more secular country. In the United States, you saw the rise of the evangelical right, and this really did lead to a whole new phenomenon in politics. Of course, we see at the moment a similar thing with Donald Trump. I have a quote here that's very interesting. I'm a true believer, and you're many true believers, I hope all. Is everybody a true believer in this room? I think so. But Christianity is under tremendous siege. Same idea. Reagan pushed the notion that Christians were up against the wall, that they were being murdered, that their beliefs were being challenged. And he tried to marshal and harness a real sense of rage against the left and against liberals and against feminism. And so if we look at the epigraphs and if we look at the dedication in The Handmaid's Tale, they're very important. Mary Webster is the person that the novel is dedicated to. She was hanged as a witch in Connecticut in 1683. Remarkably, she actually survived it. But I think what Margaret Atwood is trying to remind us is that the antecedents of Gilead were the people of Salem. They were the people who came from Puritan England. They were people inspired by witch hunting, who saw themselves as God's people. And whenever we see this in colonial politics, whether it's in South Africa, where many people were murdered by the Dutch, who again saw themselves as the children of God or God's people, Atwood is reminding us that America's foundations were not really secular. They were actually religious radicals who set up America. Professor Perry Miller was Atwood's Director of American Studies at Harvard University. And of course, his reputation was as a Puritan historian. So she's reminding us of this history in the United States, okay? Moving on to the epigraphs, the most important of the epigraphs is, of course, from Genesis. And it is the idea of Bela and the handmaid. We could actually call it the kind of governing metaphor of the book. And I've said to you in my lessons many times that I think it's the genius of the book. The ceremony is what absolutely makes The Handmaid's Tale unforgettable. And you will recall the key quote is, "She shall bear upon my knees." That's Rachel talking about Bela. What we see here is the idea of the female subject being invisible, being voiceless, having no part in the birth. This is exactly what's going to happen in Gilead, where the handmaids are simply a womb. And this seems to be endorsed by the Bible. Now, at the time, as I said before, the evangelical Christians very often would argue for the literal truth of the Bible. Gilead shows us what happens when word for word you have a society that takes the Bible as what we could call the kind of gospel truth. Another very interesting epigraph comes from Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. Swift was a satirist writing in the 18th century. And basically, as I've told you before in this is a proposal written in a highly logical language, arguing that the starving Irish people should eat their babies. The Modest Proposal goes on to offer different recipes for eating the babies. It argues for the nutritional value of the babies, and it includes things like accounting and economics, etc. And basically, as I've said, it makes the insane rational. Now, I don't have to explain that that's exactly what happens in Gilead, isn't it? Okay. If we speak in a logical way, if we put together a structured argument, if we use science and authority, we can often make the insane seem sane. And that's exactly what Gilead realize and go on to do. Now, we know that The Handmaid's Tale comes out of a dystopian tradition. We know that in particular we've spoken about its relationship to George Orwell's 1984. I wanted to talk about the fact, though, that what distinguishes it from, say, male-authored text is its obvious feminist focus. So one of the things that we should be looking at in AO4 is how Atwood gives a feminist focus to the dystopian novel. We know that she rejects the term science fiction. She doesn't like it. It seems to her to come out of a techno kind of world, which is possibly a much more male-centered world. She prefers the term speculative fiction, and we know that basically she is going to explore the idea of the handmaids as a kind of breeders, as new slaves, okay? One particular feminist who seems to have influenced her is a very famous feminist called Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote the book The Second Sex, and she talks about the fact that men define women not as autonomous beings, but simply what he decrees to be relative to him. Now, if we think of Fred, the woman has no status. She is merely predicate, never subject. So de Beauvoir says, he, that is man, is the subject. He is absolute. She is the other. And this is exactly what is occurring in Gilead. Now, I also want to point out that that Offred is a very self-conscious narrator, okay? And this is going to fit into the whole idea of metafiction, which we've seen before. Offred continually draws our attention to her storytelling and the reasons why she's telling the story. The narrative deliberately draws the reader into the action. It actually uses the second person you. She addresses the reader as dear you. Offred understands that texts are created by readers as well as writers. She understands that we as readers have an intimate relationship with her, okay? And she recognizes that she does not have ultimate authority over the story. This is an element of postmodernism, the recognition that the reader always has the ability to reinterpret the story. In fact, we're going to see that in the historical notes, aren't we? Where Professor Picciotto has a very different take on it from Offred. Offred is always questioning herself on how true her story is and where the boundaries lie between fiction and reality. Now, that's going to be quite problematic in many ways. I'll bring that up in a bit later. Now, let's not forget that she's also coming with a very heavily environmental message, isn't she? We've seen just recently a wonderful film, The Road, and also an amazing novel by Cormac McCarthy. Again, there's absolutely numerous examples of dystopian literature which explore the idea that we're ruining the world, whether that's through genetic experimentation, the manufacture of viruses, through war, through environmental catastrophe, etc. And that's exactly what is occurring in this particular novel. It's a huge interest of Margaret Atwood. And I urge you after the exams to maybe have a look at a book like Oryx and Crake, which is about where genetic experimentation is going to take us. In terms of storytelling, you know that at the end, we're told that the story is not told in the present. We know that in the night sections of the book, that's where Offred is able to recreate her past. In the day sections, Offred is telling us about contemporary Gilead, isn't she? But in the night sections, she reconstructs her past and she tells us how Gilead was actually manufactured. When we read the novel, we read it in the present tense. We feel like we are in the presence of Offred. Later, it's almost disappointing to find out that, in fact, the story is recorded. And maybe that explains many of the metafictional references in the novel. Let's not forget as well, there's the key idea of the palimpsest. Remember that? The tablet that is written over and over again. And of course, the tapes themselves include things like Twisted Sister. Again, interesting, isn't it? They chose Twisted Sister, which is a kind of heavy metal band that dressed in drag and also sort of embraced elements of Satanism, but I think in a very playful, mock way, not with anything kind of serious. But within the world of Gilead, this would be seen as evil Satanism, wouldn't it? Now, in terms of freedom and dictatorship, one of the things that Offred's going to show us is that dictatorship can almost entirely control your external world. But the act of storytelling, as we've seen, is itself an act of rebellion. It allows the individual to have an internal life and to, in many ways, resist official meanings. During the ceremony, for instance, the most brutal and ghastly element of Offred's life, at one stage she talks about the wife crying, and she talks about it being treated like a fart in a church. Again, a really humorous, kind of comical take on this. And the reader, I think, kind of likes Offred's brave resistance. Now, of course, again, coming back to the idea that she retold this story later. Perhaps that's why she was able to infuse humor. I stand up in the dark, start to unbutton. Then I hear something inside my body. I've broken. Something is cracked. That must be it. Noise is coming out of the broken place in my face. And of course, this noise is laughter. Now, we don't have that much humor in the novel, but we're reminded that in addition to storytelling, humor and laughter is incredibly resistant. And we also have the wonderful phrase, nolite despastis carburandorum, which occurs a number of times. So the act of storytelling is a form of incredible rebellion and resistance. So if you get a question on resistance, remember this ability to tell your story in a world that is trying to crush female voices and take them away would be seen as a huge form of resistance. The ceremony is much darker, however. It reminds us how power and dictatorships can control our body. Now we know, of course, don't we, the quote, the commander's effing the lower part of my body. And another two quotes that I wanted to look at that are really important are the regular 2-4 marching stroke. This is serious business. I think these are very, very important quotes because they remind us that one of the darker elements of Gilead, and we could argue of the Christian right in general, is the notion that sexuality is there for procreation. This is the philosophy that guides the notion, perhaps in the Catholic Church, that you shouldn't have contraception. And so the actual sex, if we could call it that, she doesn't call it that, is actually instead treated within the semantic field of business or within a highly mechanical world. And it's a world in which the body and the narrative are intimately connected, because you'll notice here her body is disconnected from her. It's mutilated and amputated. And a number of times she is going to draw attention to the close relationship between her body and the narrative structure, both of which are amputated. And in the end, double amputated because of the historical notes. and the fact that Professor Picciotto fragments the narrative even more. Another lovely little bit of AO3 is we're reminded that in Gilead, the woman lies back and thinks of England. Now, there are a lot of parallels to the kind of Victorian world, aren't there? Even the bed that they're on is meant to represent a kind of four-poster Victorian bed. And again, it's this notion of taking women's sexual agency from them. Because Gilead is a world in which female passion and female desire is absolutely criminalized. And that's something that very much disturbs Atwood about conservative thinking. Of course, Serena Joy could be seen as a victim herself. She, as we know, is imprisoned in the domestic sphere. Atwood draws parallels, doesn't she, between Offred and Serena Joy. Have a look at this quote. So she won't be caught listening as she sits there knitting, remembering her own former glory and now amputated glory with the lovely, ironic hallelujah. Okay. Again, the humor coming through, but just reminding us that even though we may not like Serena as readers, she is in fact also a victim. The difference being, of course, is that it is a kind of victimhood that she helped to impose. Serena, she has become speechless. She stays in her home, but it doesn't seem to agree with now. Wonderful quote here, how furious she must be now that she's been taken at her word. You could say that this is Atwood's sort of revenge on the Christian right group of women. And Serena Joy is a kind of warning to them of what will occur if they have this kind of Christian theocracy based upon biblical law. I said to you before, didn't I, that televangelism was one of the things that really scared Atwood, and I've told you many times in the 1980s this was absolutely exploding. It was going well beyond traditional people like Billy Graham. The advent of satellite television meant that Christian evangelical thinking was being pushed further and more on daytime television. And of course, we could see Serena Joy as a kind of parody of the virtuous woman, okay? Serena's present life is a parody of the virtuous woman who is described in the Old Testament. She is ruled by her husband and puts his needs first. Has this agreed with her? No, because every time we see her, she seems incredibly angry. Even knitting a scarf, you will recall, becomes a militant kind of act. And you will remember that the fir trees march on the scarf. We feel her anger in everything. And in particular, it seems to be directed against her garden. Wonderfully, the garden is referred to as a subversive garden. She is fruitless. She is without reproduction herself. And Atwood brilliantly draws attention to the fact that flowers seem to have a kind of sexuality, which is why in that highly memorable scene, we see Serena viciously cutting the heads off the flowers as though to kind of castrate them. So again, there's humor in that, isn't there? Even in her garden, there is rebellion. Nature seems to be against her version of the world. Now I'm going to move over to the Republic of Gilead, okay? And I'm going to look at what it represents and what it tells us and how it warns contemporary people. I've told you many times, I think it's very interesting in terms of AO5, that The Handmaid's Tale is very popular again, alongside 1984. And without doubt, we can see this as the advent of Bush, as Brexit, and at the moment, a fear of what we could call fake media, and the notion that we don't know what is true anymore, and that we are being manipulated. You'll notice that the right in particular are exploding with conspiracy theories of the big state, etc. This is precisely what happens in Gilead. They're able to pull the wool over people's eyes, they're able to use and manufacture truth, and they're able to use the army to destroy liberal democracy. What is Atwood telling us about the seizure of power? She's warning us that people are apathetic. She's warning us that dangerous conservative forces are at work, that revolution is stealthy, But people in Gilead, of course, sleepwalk into this revolution, don't they? They allow people's freedom to be taken away, like the porno marts. That's because they don't like them. But maybe Margaret Atwood is saying to us that if you have your First Amendment rights taken away, if you take them away from marginalized groups, there will be a time when it is you and your rights that are taken away. Of course, the absolute key is control of the media. And we're reminded in Gilead that technology will work against us. That in the world of computers, only the flick of a switch can turn channels off, can close bank accounts. One of the things about Gilead is that it is effective in its use of technology. Again, you might want to draw parallels today with the alt-right, with 4chan, with the manufacture of news, with the use of bots by Russia. And I feel as though there are lots of parallels to this, yes? Technology does enable sinister people to seize control much more easily. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Nazi Germany, but I do want to remind you that Margaret Atwood wasn't only talking about Nazi Germany. She uses a compilation of lots and lots of different places. She does not have one single model in mind. We also need to think about Iran. We also need to think about the Christian right, etc., etc. Now, the Reichstag fire, I'm going to go through this very quickly, is a very interesting point, because Marinus was the Dutch communist who was supposedly responsible for this fire, that burned down the German parliament. The Nazis were able then to put him forward as the villain. And likewise, do you recall that in Gilead, they are able to blame Islamicists for the murder and destruction of Parliament, when in fact they did it themselves? Margaret Atwood here is peddling her own conspiracy theory, showing that actually you can choose vulnerable groups, marginalized groups who hate it, and you can use them to cloak your very sinister actions. Well, this is exactly what Hitler did. And of course, we know in the 1930s that Hitler and his proxies were magnificent in terms of promoting an absolute hatred of the Jews, of projecting every single thing onto them, of blaming them. Now, of course, Atwood shows that Gilead also has its hate figures, in particular gay people, radical feminists, and they're able to direct propaganda movies and generate hatred against them. On a street level too, one of the things that Gilead is very good at, just like the Nazis who used SS stormtroopers, let's not forget that Gilead uses the angels, doesn't it? It uses force as well as mental conditioning. And these displays of force are absolutely key to power. We're reminded that this is a bit like the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who says that in feudal times, displays of power, of terror, of torture are everywhere. Let's not forget, Gilead was almost like medieval Britain, where in the Tower of London you would chop off the heads of various people and you'd put them on spikes for people to see. People are reminded everywhere that power is amongst them and around them, and that at any stage their body could be torn apart and tortured. Now, in the liberal humanist world, this is meant to be out of fashion. Margaret Atwood has shown us that actually it's just round the corner. And this kind of conspicuous punishment may have referred in part to Iran, where, of course, for instance, this is something that occurred quite recently. Regularly in Iran, gay people are suspended from cranes, kicked and beaten to death, in something which is very similar to the partisecution. So let's not forget that Margaret Atwood is casting her net quite wide. She's looking at various people who she sees as the enemies of liberal democracy and of human rights. The partisecution is a brilliant invention. Partly, I'm going to relate it to this, George Orwell, and the idea of newspeak, where language is controlled and where new words are produced. If we think of partisecution, we can see that it combines the idea of execution with the idea of participation. This element of participation is really interesting because it's a kind of distorted form of democracy, isn't it? In which people are given the chance to take part in the killing. You could almost see it as kind of appropriation of feminism, couldn't you? Because it's women who tear this man apart for a rape upon a woman. Of course, the actual charge is manufactured. But if you want to see it as a kind of distortion of feminism, you can. I thought that was interesting just to remind you here of the little leaflet that was produced by the Iranian authorities showing people how to stone a woman to death, how deep to bury her, and how many stones to use to bash her head in. Again, Margaret Atwood always wanted us to remember that she invented nothing, that this is all true history, and that she took various practices, cruel practices around the world to inform her story. So I talked a little bit about the militant right. Now in the 1980s, it became extremely militant, okay? And in this case, you can see people who are anti-abortion. Well, in some cases, shootings occurred, attacks on people. The idea of a kind of Christian militia was there. And I think that this is something that Atwood was very aware of and wanted people to think about. This rise of something which in the past might have been seen as like communist revolutionaries. But here, the mainstream right getting more and more militant. We see it every day now in America, don't we? We see Donald Trump supporters with machine guns threatening to do anything to protect him. This has become something that we're almost used to. Now, I spoke a bit about Newspeak 1984 and this idea of controlling language and how we are able to redefine reality. I think that that's going to be very important. And of course, the most important people in terms of psychological conditioning become the arts. It's a kind of irony, isn't it, that women are used to condition women. Now, maybe Atwood is telling us something that radical feminism may not have liked, and it's something that is apparent when we look across the world, whether we're looking at female genital mutilation, which is usually practiced by women on women. What Atwood is reminding us is it's not only men who oppress women. You could, of course, argue that the aunts are being controlled by patriarchy, aren't they? But they're certainly willing acolytes within that. In the marvelous scene with Janine, we all know the quote, "Her fault, her fault, her fault," we chant in unison. We see that Gilead are not averse to using modern ideas of psychological conditioning. That I think, Richard, they would be behaviorists, wouldn't they? And they would see the wisdom of this notion that all you need to change people's behavior is constancy and reward and punishment. In particular, we have Aunt Lydia. Here she is in her marvelous outfit from the recent television series. And I think that one of the things that Margaret Atwood is reminding us that in the 1980s, for instance, many, many women on the right, traditional women, Christian women, fought against the proposed Equal Rights Amendment Act to the American Constitution. They didn't want equal rights. And of course, we could go back as well and see, and something that people don't like to admit today, for as many suffragettes as they were in the 19th century, there were as many anti-suffragettes too. The notion that women are embracing their own freedom is something that Atwood seems to be interrogating. I think one of the most brilliant things in it is the use of semantics. Again, how language works. And we know that Aunt Lydia's creed is freedom to and freedom from. She describes a society dying of too much choice. That is exactly the language that seems to come out of the right-wing lexicon. The idea that democracy and choice is actually corrupt. And it's a notion that we are living in a permissive society and that we need backbone and discipline. So I think Atwood is looking at the right-wing lexicon, she's drawing upon it, and she's seen its power. Aunt Lydia says freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, it was freedom to. Now we're giving you freedom from. It's the notion, isn't it, that women need to be protected, that heterosexual society is evil, that men by nature are voracious sexual animals, that there's nothing you can do about this. The only way to do this is to cover women up, seclude them and hide them. The idea that society is dangerous to women. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you have this great irony, don't you? That patriarchy is right, but men are animals. Again, looking at that interesting paradox there. We've spoken about this before, haven't we? One of the things that the right wing drew upon quite a great deal in the 1980s was AIDS. And let's not forget, AIDS was a nebulous disease. No one really knew what it was. And it was conflated by the Christian right with homosexuality. And of course, it was seen as a kind of God's plague. Now, in Gilead, we know that there have been multiple plagues and women have been stricken with infertility and the seas are poisoned, etc. Very often, in terms of Christian discourse, this is seen not as mankind's creation, but rather evidence of God's wrath. And that this is then used as a green light to attack people and to close down freedom and democracy. Maybe this is why Offred's narration is so fragmented. One of the things is, because truth is so hard to rely on, she doesn't know what's going on. Professor Picciotto later is going to criticize her, isn't he, for not writing about the state, not being more of a journalist. But I want to remind you that one of the reasons why she has such a fragmented narrative is because she has a fragmented perspective. She simply doesn't know, does she? She doesn't have access. The only time we see her watching the news, she has to do it surreptitiously, and the news is so filled with propaganda. Maybe this is why she says she keeps going, sad and hungry, with this limping and mutilated story. Again, one of the leitmotifs of the novel, mutilated and limping, which she equates with her body. So I wanted to remind you that her body and the narrative in many ways are one. This seems to draw off the feminist theory of Helena Cixous, a French feminist. Hard to spell, so look at her name there. She comes up with the idea of écriture féminine, or female writing. And in this, she postulates the idea that women write with their bodies. Unlike men whose writing usually is very linear, it aims to be easy to understand. Think of Professor Picciotto, who's looking for this kind of objectivity. Cixous says women's writing is like their bodies, ever-changing. And if you remember, Offred often imagines her body, and she talks about it. She says, "Only I know the footing," talking about her body. Her body has been taken as a natural resource. She tries to take it back. In a way, writing becomes an act of reclaiming her body. She actually even describes the rhythms of a menstrual cycle. She uses the image of the night sky studded with stars and traversed by the moon. It becomes a kind of dark space that only she knows. And once again, a form of resistance to the kind of patriarchal world that wants to own her. This, of course, fits in with the whole idea of metafiction. That is literature which draws attention to its own constructiveness, yeah? Just like these hands here are drawing each other, well, so with metafiction, we don't really know what is fiction and what isn't. The fictionality of the work is highlighted, and that happens many times in The Handmaid's Tale. In particular, it happens with the multiple narration regarding Nick. One of the reasons why we can't really understand Nick is because Offred doesn't allow us to understand him. We never go into Nick's mind, do we? Nick is never a focalizer. Offred always sees him from the outside. But that's partly, I think, because she wants a tall, dark stranger as a lover, doesn't she? She often describes him in those terms. It's also that we just never know whether to believe her or not. His mouth is on me, his hands, I can't wait, and he's moving, already love. It's been so long, I'm alive in my skin, again, arms around him, falling, and water softly everywhere. Seems almost like a parody of sex in a romance novel, doesn't it? And then, of course, she tells us, I made that up. It didn't happen that way. Here is what's happened. 3 different versions we're giving of Nick, aren't we? But we don't really know which one to believe. Just very differently, I wanted to see here with Billy Graham, who was one of the very big evangelical people who's only died recently, I believe, but really was a huge preacher around the world and literally had hundreds of millions of people in his audience, okay? Look at this. We have confused liberty with license, and we are paying the awful price. We're on a society on the brink of self-destruction. This is 1996 again. This idea of too much liberty is something that exists very much within right-wing rhetoric, and we see that over and over again. I'm now going to move on to the commander, because he's such an interesting figure. In his own private territory, the commander appears to be almost benign. He's kind. When he's playing Scrabble with Offred, he's positively daddyish, you see, isn't he, yeah? And he seems to have the ability to compartmentalize his life. This seems to me to be a very Victorian ability. The idea to go to a prostitute, to go to a brothel, etc., to use women in this way, but to come out of that role and be a religious man. As Offred says here, in many ways the commander's motives and needs remain obscure. She doesn't really understand him. Arguably, he doesn't really understand himself. He's created this culture, but it's a culture in the end that he doesn't like, okay? And now, I'm just going to go on to this bit over here. Second wave feminism. Now, in second wave feminism, some of you will know this is really late 60s and 70s into the 80s, okay? This drew attention to issues of domestic violence, marital rape. It really helped grow rape centers, women's shelters, and it really went out and tried to help women in many ways. It was often extremely radical. And it drew attention to the dark elements of male objectification of women. Now, I've said this before, and it's very interesting that this is Offred's mother. She draws attention, doesn't she, to all of the objectification of women. And that's why, when she is seen burning books at the auto da fe in the park, she is next to Christian women. And this is very interesting, isn't it? Atwood is kind of reminding us that it's sometimes very dangerous to want to ban pornography and prostitution and all of these things. That an element of this aligns very much with the Christian right. So not only do we have this kind of sinisterness of burning books, as I said earlier, Offred is also warning us of the dangers of technology making dictatorship much easier. Some of you will recall that one of the things why Gilead is able to come to power is that they are able to use the CompuBank and simply turn off women's accounts immediately, aren't they? So I think Atwood is reminding us, in addition to the dangers of burning books, when we surrender our identity and our bank accounts to technology, we are in serious trouble. And I think that Margaret Atwood would look at the use of the internet at the moment and look at our lack of privacy. And something for you to do, which is a sort of AO3, AO4, would be that Atwood is lining up with other liberals who are arguing that we should be very careful about what's been done to us technologically. And therefore, she aligns with classic stories like Metropolis, one of the greatest films ever made. Not sure any of you will like it because it's black and white from the 1930s, made by the brilliant German expressionist director Fritz Lang. And in Fritz Lang's movie, we're shown that the metropolis will be able to control us through technology and through plenty and consumerism. I guess what's a little bit different, of course, in terms of the use of technology in The Handmaid's Tale, is that there isn't plenty. In fact, we go back to a kind of feudal ration cards, don't we? But look at this. They've frozen them. Mine too. The collectives too. Any account with an F on it. Also, let's not forget the awfulness of the Soul Scrolls. Behind it are the printout machines, row on row. We know them as the holy rollers, okay? They put prayers on them. They're ordered by CompuPhone. I've overheard the commander's wife doing it. So this is like, not dial a pizza, this is kind of dial a prayer, isn't it? It seems empty and soulless, but it shows us the power of technology in this horrible dystopian world. Now, changing track a little bit, the historical notes. In many ways, I think the most interesting part of the novel. When I first taught the book, the class were really disappointed by the historical notes and couldn't understand why they're there. But I think they're there for a very, very good reason. And I think one of the things of why they may disappoint readers is because we're left in the lurch by Offred, aren't we? We don't know what happens to her. It's kind of like a dark future. We look in, we want to know what happens, but we don't know. And then we're switched to this highly academic, abstract kind of narration. It's a massive lexical change. And one of the things I think that Offred is showing us is that history is not really good at telling stories, is it? Think of the way that we study history. Do we actually go into people's minds? Do we consider their worlds and their subjectivity? Or do we say, oh, that's all too messy? We're not even going to go there. What we're going to study is facts. We're going to study history like it's a kind of form of science, that we're detached. So I think it's very interesting that one of the things that Atwood seems to be, putting into the sights of her gun is academic thinking. And maybe she's also suggesting this is very patriarchal and very phallocentric, because Professor Picciotto is a male chauvinist pig, is he not? He makes jokes about women's backsides, the Handmaid's Tale. He makes jokes about the frail road, the railroad. He really is someone of coarse, bad taste, is he not? And wonderfully, Atwood sends us a little clue, doesn't she? She says, the University of Denying None of It. Now that is actually a real place, and this is why that's an amazing pun. But of course, she's asking for us to believe in Offred's story. She's asking us to go with Offred, the woman who suffered, who shared this amazing tale with us, not with the complete idiot who's, at this historical conference, and the day before, they all got dressed up in handmaid and commander uniforms to have a good time, as though history is some kind of recreational park. I think one of the reasons that the historical notes are there is to actually remind us that one of the things that we need to do as human beings is to try and empathize and emotionally connect with people from the past. We're reminded, aren't we, of the tapes by Professor Picciotto. And to maybe us, as readers or listeners, that shows how far Offred went to give us the story, and how those tapes were hidden, and how courageous she was, and how the story is dismissed, I think is very disappointing and causes us great pain. So this is the last reconstruction of Offred's tale, and in itself it's sharply satirical of academic methods, isn't it? We've talked already about the female frail road, etc. For all Picciotto's scholarship, he cannot get beyond generalities. This is the interesting view. He actually criticizes Offred's tale for being emotional, personal, subjective. In fact, you could argue for being female. I would say that there's a strong element of misogyny in his tale. But his own take on the tale is truncated and blind in many ways. Of course, a key figure for us to always remember is Eurydice, the idea that the historian goes back into the past, like Orpheus, he goes into the underworld and he tries to rescue Eurydice, but he can't. She slips from our grasp and flees. Well, he gave up very easily, and there's something revolting about the fact that he casts himself as a kind of ancient Greek hero who does his best to recognize and rescue this woman. In actual fact, I think many of us would say that's not in fact the case, and that he lacks historical imagination. Finally, I'm going to dwell very quickly on Jezebels, okay? Jezebels, I think, is one of the most amazing and interesting aspects of the novel. It is the dark underbelly of the novel. It reminds us in most dictatorships there is a kind of libidinal area, a place for sex and drugs and rock and roll, because it is forced out of the public sphere, and it seems like a kind of Freudian idea, doesn't it? That if you repress all the stuff, it will re-emerge elsewhere, and it will re-emerge in a corrupted and distorted form. Of course, the name Jezebel itself is educative, isn't it, for us? Because Jezebel is perhaps the most loathed female in the Bible. She's someone associated with sex. But of course, after the sex, she is thrown from the balcony and fed to dogs. That's a pretty harsh kind of thing to happen to you, isn't it, class? And it's interesting because one of the key things I'm going to be arguing about is what Atwood shows us, and it's a very familiar feminist argument, is that fetishism of women's bodies and hate and violence seem to be very closely interlinked. Interestingly enough, a number of times Atwood, or I should say Offred, refers to the fact that boredom is meant to be erotic. She describes the harem. Do you remember this? And she talks about waiting. And there's a wonderful, wonderful quote here where she says, these pictures are supposed to be erotic, but maybe boredom is erotic when women do it for men. So what was it about Jezebels and all of this waiting that made it erotic? It's the idea that women have no agency. They wait around to be had sex with, and that is what turns the men on. It's this kind of notion that they have no agency. Of course, we've spoken before about the fact that what's even more exciting is the fact that these women are powerful. And I think that this is one thing that Atwood's warning us, that women are getting more powerful, especially in the Western world, professional women. We know today that women have far more degrees than men, etc. And that seems to have produced a kind of conservative backlash from some men. And these are men who will delight in bringing women down. So Atwood is warning us of that. Now we know that Gloria Steinem, as we spoke before, wrote a fantastic study called A Bunny Tale. This is when she went underground and she worked as a bunny girl in one of Hugh Hefner's clubs. Hugh Hefner is pretty much directly named, isn't he, in Jezebel? We're meant to think about him. And one of the terrible things about Hugh Hefner is he cast himself as a feminist. He always said, I want women to have sexual freedom, etc. But one of the things that Atwood is showing is that this isn't really sexual freedom for women. It's sexual freedom for men, isn't it, to use women. And what's so disappointing about Jezebels is that the commander and Gilead are not only shown to be brutal, they're shown to be hypocritical liars who do not even, live by the religious tenets that they want everyone else to live by. And the most memorable of all the scenes is the scene when Offred is the narrator and she tells us that she sees Moira. Attached to her head are two ears of a rabbit or a deer. Of course, the whole costume is dilapidated. She has a black bow tie around her neck and black high heels. And of course, perhaps the most important thing is the sanitary pad, her little bunny tail. And we feel such a sense of disappointment that this has occurred to Moira. Even more so that we'll see later that Moira has become resigned to this terrible fate. What's very interesting is you could align this with the feminist theory of Judith Butler, who wrote a fantastic book called Gender Trouble, in which Butler reminds us that gender is not biology. It's not created through genes. It's not DNA that makes women dress up as bunnies. It's society. Gender is socially constructed, or in Judith Butler's words, gender is a performance. And the performance that the commander seeks from Offred is to be a willing sexual tool. Each month, we know that he has sex with her in the ceremony, but he does it mechanically. Now he wants her to give herself willingly. But if you recall, the most sinister and terrible thing about it is, in order to eroticize the whole encounter, he strokes her body and his fingers encircle her ankle. They encircle her ankle because he is feeling the marks of her tattoo that identify her as his property. And that's what turns him on. It's the ownership. And the horrendous intertextual reference this has to the tattooing of the Jews in Auschwitz should not be lost on the educated reader. And you may even be thinking about the whole kind of barcode world, because that seems to me an element of dystopian fiction, that we as human beings at the moment are being barcoded, defined, etc. And those of you who've seen what happened recently with Cambridge Analytica on Facebook will be seeing that we are being treated as marketing information. So to end with Jezebels, what's so interesting is that the sexualized woman is despised and criminalized, but at the same time cultivated and fetishized, hated and desired. And this is something that goes to the absolute heart of feminist theory, this recognition that within patriarchy, they want to have sex with you, but they want to hurt you too. And that is what's so sinister about Jezebels. And I think, once again, another element of the absolute genius of this novel is to represent the contradictions in the society. We could end by saying the number of evangelical Christians who found in bed with prostitutes testifies to the kind of contradictions that seem to lie at the center of this way of thinking.